All right, we are live for today's webinar on legal compliance for modern software development with Evan LeBon, the VP and head of legal at Abnormal Security. Thanks so much to everyone for being here. We're just going to give it a few minutes so folks can make their way into the webinar before we get started, but hope you're having a wonderful Wednesday wherever you are in the world. And like I said, we're just going to give it a few minutes, another minute or so before we get started. But Evan, thanks again for joining us. Hope second day in November is treating you well.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's great to be here. We were just chatting before we went live there about quarter close for us was it was Halloween, so I'm sort of stuck dealing with as I'm sure we all can understand on this call, the legal team members of us, there's no rest for the weary after a quarter close. So it's all the stuff that pushed in the last 2 weeks. We're kind of digging out of that right now. So, but it's a good quarter. Halloween was really fun, and happy that it's November now. So.
Yes. For folks just making your way into the webinar now, welcome. We'll get started in a few seconds. I think our last kickoff question is favorite Halloween costume, Evan.
Favorite Halloween costume. I really enjoy the classic witch costume, witch's hat, green face paint, that sort of thing. And then anything that's clever. There was one that I saw the other day, and I'm blanking on it now that I'm on the spot, that I thought was extremely clever.
Yeah.
But anything where, it's I like the literal costumes where somebody dresses up as something and it's just a very literal.
Yes.
Yes. Those are
Next webinar, Evan analyzes Halloween costumes.
Yeah.
All right. With that, we'll get started. Thanks to everyone for being here. We're really excited that you've joined us for this webinar on the recent evolution of software development and how in-house legal teams can respond, featuring Evan LeBon, VP and head of legal at Abnormal Security. My name is Andy Drugarev. I'm on the team here at FOSSA. I'll be your host for today's discussion. Before I go over our agenda and introduce Evan, I just have a few housekeeping points to pass along. First, we'll try to answer any audience questions as they're submitted, but if we can't get to them, we also will have a few minutes at the end for a Q&A. So please do feel free to post any questions you have in the questions section of your BrightTalk console. Now, finally, we at FOSSA will be following up with you after the webinar with a few additional resources and to see if there's anything we can do to help your organization with open source license compliance. This webinar is being recorded, and when we reach out to you, you will also receive a copy of the recording and a copy of the slide deck. So now let's take a look at today's agenda. The first part of our webinar will cover how software development has evolved in recent years and the resulting challenges for in-house legal teams. The second part will dive into a variety of solutions and strategies to address these challenges. And then, as I mentioned, at the end, we will have a few minutes for a Q&A if we don't get to questions that are submitted during the presentation. Now, before I hand things off to Evan, just a final quick word for folks who are not familiar with FOSSA. We provide technology that helps a variety of organizations manage their use of open source. Specifically, businesses use our products to identify dependencies in open source code and also identify and comply with open source licenses. Obviously, the focus of today's presentation, along with the broader software development ecosystem and connection to in-house counsel. Now, really excited to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Evan LeBon, who's the VP and head of legal at Abnormal Security. Evan is a technology-focused attorney who's had a front row seat to the engineering changes we'll be discussing today. We're thrilled to have him on today's webinar. And with that, Evan, perhaps you could share a few more words about your background, current project in the science of volcanoes.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the kind introduction and for having me. And then also thank you to everybody for joining. I know these webinars are always like really interesting things that kind of crop up in your feed, and maybe you join, maybe you don't. So if you've taken the time today, thanks for joining. Hopefully we'll have some kind of pragmatic discussion about primarily like how to handle just like get a grip on the current environment and what lawyers can do, or what, at least from my viewpoint, what lawyers can do to kind of be dangerous in that environment in good ways, right? Like and so I think in terms of like my background, as Andy mentioned, I'm a technology focused lawyer. I've been working in software companies, B2B software companies, for the last decade, primarily at AppDynamics and then Cisco after AppDynamics was acquired by Cisco, on the doorstep of our IPO, which is a very interesting story. Anybody wants to hit me up about that later, happy to talk about it. But a lot of that has been focused on supporting GTM teams, and then eventually product counseling, and working really heavily with engineers in both worlds. The volcano scientist piece is something that I did in undergrad. I was a research assistant for a professor who did geochemistry of volcanic magma and lava, and so I did a lot of traveling and research trips and work in that field. So that's the fun fact, I guess. And then in terms of current projects, working in more of a generalist capacity now, or much more of a generalist capacity now, and trying to build out a team at a company called Abnormal Security. Abnormal is a company that was founded just a few years ago. Post Series C financing is sort of the stage we're in now, and we're providing email security primarily, but sort of targeting other communication systems in an office environment over the next couple of years. That's kind of the roadmap. So figuring out ways to secure, a business environment from basically, sort of like vendor fraud type of activities would be a classic use case for us. So been really fun, and that's kind of what I'm working on now.
Thanks, Evan, for that great introduction. And now, as we kick off the meat of the presentation, wondering if you could talk us through some of the changes in software development, the biggest ones that you've seen in recent years, of course, with a focus on the changes that are most relevant and have the biggest impact for in-house legal teams.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really important to spend some time on this, and I think that this for me was, I've had several conversations with a bunch of folks at FOSSA. Full disclosure, I am a FOSSA customer and have been in my previous companies as well. And I think like in some of those discussions over the years with folks at FOSSA, like we've had a lot of really interesting chats about just this change, right? Like there's really been a tectonic shift, to stick with the geology theme of the day, I suppose, in sort of how software teams work. When I was just starting out at AppDynamics in my in-house career, which wasn't that long ago, really like a decade ago, software teams were working in really long release cycles and really long development cycles. So we shipped a major release of our product twice a year. So every 6 months we'd have a major release, and then every sort of halfway point between those 6 months, we'd have these patch releases that went out. And then you'd have hot fixes and things that would happen from time to time for security problems and things like that. But the real sort of meat of what you were shipping was developed on these really long cycles, and you'd have these infrequent releases. Over time, as more and more development activities shifted into sort of an agile mindset, and we'll get into that in the next slide, give you a framework for thinking about that, and to more frequent releases, which primarily like SaaS has enabled, and modern computing has enabled. So Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, Azure for Microsoft, those sort of platforms have enabled people to develop, and deliver software in very different ways than a traditional sort of binary that you zip and ship, and a customer downloads it from a download zone and installs it in a runtime on their side. So when I was at AppDynamics, I mean, just seeing that shift from kind of on-prem to SaaS and waterfall release cycles to sort of monthly agile release cycles was huge. And it happened sort of about halfway through that journey when I was there. So I sort of saw some of it, and then it changed, right? And the change was pretty dramatic. And so I think part of the reason I'm here today going over this is because it really changed my viewpoint and how I had to work and support my business from a legal perspective. So I think hopefully I can share some experience and thought about that, and it'll help orient folks on the call to how you might want to develop a plan to support your businesses. So let's talk a little bit about what that tectonic shift actually looked like. So like I mentioned, teams were really working in kind of these infrequent waterfall release cycles, where it was just a very heavy kind of like plan, develop, test, deploy, release, and that would take these very long burn. And everything was staged, and it kind of moved a lot more slowly. The frequent releases sort of moving to like breaking out your services into more, microservice oriented. That's a big buzzword people hear all the time, to different modular components in a SaaS application. And each component can kind of be dissected and worked on differently by different teams or pods that sort of get siloed, and they're all working less together in this huge master plan and more in these kind of modern agile methodology workspaces or pods. Oftentimes teams will organize by pods. That's a buzzword these days I'm hearing a lot to describe agile effectively. But this is kind of the visual that shows that shift, right? Like that traditional waterfall model was a very like linear plan that was very, sort of focused through the stages and gates, and it would take a very long time frame. So imagine that waterfall model is taking you like 6 months. The agile shift is really this iterative approach where you're taking like very small tweaks to a set of features or a service that supports some aspect of the product you're delivering, and you're isolating that thing or that feature, and you're trying to iterate on it quickly. And so that could mean that you've got a team or a couple of teams getting together, going out, coming up with a problem statement about what they want to solve about what's wrong with that feature, going out and doing interviews and analysis with customers, for example, designing sort of the 3 fixes they want to make, implementing those quickly, and then testing it quickly, and then bringing it all back into the next 2-week or month-long sprint. And that's really the shift. Those are fundamentally different approaches. They have a lot of the same aspects, but it's just the organization of the work and the timing of the work has really shifted. And so I would say, from my perspective, every software team I've worked with in the last 3 years, no one's doing waterfall anymore. And so you really are living in this agile world. So I think the shift has occurred. And so that's the reason I'm spending time here, is because I think we all need to, as lawyers supporting software teams and software-driven businesses, understanding this shift and knowing that we're working in this agile world. It's often something that's very obvious, but if you don't stop and think about what it means from time to time, it can actually sort of impede your projects and your own compliance activities.
Thanks, Evan, for that great explanation. And I think obviously this sort of begs the question when we look at the change in how software development works, sort of what specific parts of that evolution have been particularly challenging for in-house legal teams from your experience, and kind of everything really that goes along with, to continue with the volcano theme with the tectonic chain.
Yeah, and the tectonic change. I mean, I think I touched on it in the intro in the last couple slides, but I think that the real change for me was just the compression of the timelines. So going from a very clear sort of linear progression of like, this is the master plan. We have a 6-month release cycle where that's the date we're going to release this new major version of this thing, right? And all these teams coming together and working against that giant waterfall plan. And it was very easy to see, oh, well, I have like 3 weeks to do this project, this legal piece of it, right? Like the privacy review of this may, I can slot it in here and I have time, right? Or at least there's the perception that you have time because it's a big project. You can put things, put the pegs in the calendar and like sort of anchor to like that visual and that timeline. And I think that perception of time wasn't always accurate, but mostly it was, right? And so I use like open source management as an example. When I was at AppDynamics early on, we didn't have any tooling at all. It was we had 3 engineers who understood the build systems and understood how our software was constructed and how to pull the bill of materials using scripts basically that they're writing themselves, and that would get us the information we would need, and we would do basically a static manual review of what was in our code base in terms of a licensing perspective, like what pieces of open source and what proprietary code was being used, like twice a year, every 6 months, right? And that was good enough. And as long as we slotted those reviews in the right place in the waterfall, it worked. I think when you compress the timeline and then expand and blow out all the projects into these sort of like distributed teams working in asynchronously, and that all of that stuff comes together at some point to create the product, but it's all in the background, this kind of web of interrelated projects that are all charging on in their own cadence and their own timeline with their own teams. It becomes really challenging to understand, okay, where do I slot in? What teams do I care about? Do I even know what all the teams are? Where can I, and then on top of that complexity, you're then shrinking the timeline. So to me, that's because every release is now not 6 months, it's a month potentially, right? So I have a week to do that open source review, and it has to be done in that month because that's when the new release is happening, instead of 6 months from now. So I think that perception of time that you had before and the clear gates you could have inserted before into one project, that is now a whole bunch of different projects working on very tight timelines asynchronously. And so it's less obvious, I think, where your time's going to be and where you're going to put that effort, and sort of when you're going to put that effort in. So I think a lot of that is kind of summarized on the slide here. I think so the ways that challenges in that environment crop up are, where do I build in automation? How do I be as iterative as my engineers? Sort of where am I going to insert reviews that are static and reviews that are dynamic? And this could be open source or it could be privacy. Another example is privacy, right? So compliance reviews for understanding data usage in the product. Like, where do you insert those in this new agile world, right? That's sort of not as obvious as it was when you just looked at that huge project plan and I could insert my privacy gate there, right? So I think just understanding the mindset of the developer community and sort of how it's changed, and just accepting that that's the reality, is probably a big hurdle to clear if you want to be effective. And then I would say the last piece of this is just understanding that like there are tools that are solving these challenges, but the proliferation of those tools in and of itself is a challenge. So like lawyers 20 years ago, a lot of us were just like LexisNexis. Like, that's what we do. We like look up case law, and we have like, alerts that come from our law firms. We go to CLE courses, right? Like, nobody's asking me to be an expert in an engineering platform. But if you're in-house at a software-driven company, chances are you probably need to know some of that stuff. and you may even be buying other tools, like a TrustArc, for example, or some other privacy compliance platform that didn't exist, 5, 8, 10 years ago, but now is like where you spend a lot of time today. So that's kind of a summary of the challenges as I see them.
Yeah, no, thanks, Evan, for that overview. And I think now that you've really discussed and laid out how software development has changed and the challenges that have accompanied that shift, this is sort of part two of the webinar, which is, of course, a discussion of how to solve some of these concerns. And first, I know that there are a few guiding principles that are really top of mind for you and you view as particularly important when trying to deal with this from a legal perspective.
Yeah, so I think starting from a principle-based approach is always really helpful. As I've matured in my career and gained experience in this, this has dawned on me that this is the kind of a way to do it. I will tell you that this is not these principles are not things that are intuitive or that I have done well or even still do well today, but it's stuff to strive for, right? So I think it's really important to kind of like anchor on what are some of the things that are going to guide me through this mess of crazy that we live in this sort of technology, in-house world. And so I think like here they are. And these aren't stack ranked at all. These are just sort of, how they came to me when we were talking about it. But get in early. And so that one really means, take control of what you can control. And part of that is where you insert and assert yourself. And that doesn't mean that you're going to be the Department of No landing and saying, hey, don't build this, or that's a bad idea, or I'm spitballing, on some topic I don't understand, and I'm the lawyer coming in, and armchair quarterbacking this project of engineering work. What it means is get in there, get stuck into the problem, and try to do it as early as possible. And thinking back to kind of like the waterfall image and the agile image, right? If your team is working in an agile fashion, which it probably is today, think about how to get onto that loop early in the loop, right? If you look back at that loop, there's often a period called discovery or design, or iteration. There might that part where the loop begins. You want to figure out where your teams are doing that and when they're doing that, and that's where you want to at least be informed. Like, what the hell are you building, right? Tell me about it. Like, that's really exciting. What is it? What problem is it it's solving, right? Start asking some basic questions early, because the later you get injected into that process, the less time, especially in this short cycle universe we're living in now, the less time you're going to have to actually influence a decision or stop a really bad problem that occasionally does occur, from sort of proliferating itself and then getting baked into something that's much harder to fix later. So principle is just kind of get in early, get stuck into the problem, ask questions. Meet developers where they are. So understand that to be effective, this is really hard to do, but to be effective, try your best to empathize, try your best to learn as much as you can about what developers are doing, how they work, where they work, when they work, the types of ways their teams organize, sort of where they catalog their projects. All of that can be really useful in just helping you understand the pressures they're under, the complexity of the work they're doing. And that can help you kind of strategize about how to get into the mix in a way that actually doesn't kind of stays out of their way, because when it works best, you're not in their way, right? You're actually part of the team, you're influencing and guiding versus sort of like roadblocking and gating. And so I think meeting developers where they are is really important. Be flexible. This one is really hard for lawyers. I think we all index to being more conservative generally. That's part of why we probably went to law school and were attracted to the profession in the first place, is risk mitigation and, justice and equality and like fairness and balancing, risk and reward and all those things. I think in a tech, the reality of being in business and then the reality of being in the tech world is that you have to be flexible and you have to sort of adopt an approach that may be uncomfortable. So I think the thinking about, for the principle of this, thinking about balancing velocity and your business objectives with your own internal desire for this to be perfect, and just being constantly aware of where you are in that balance, and that you're not ever going to, and then just recognizing you're never going to get to legal perfection, as I'm sure that's probably dawned on most of us, and whether we want to believe it or not, that's probably the truth. So that's the be flexible principle. And then I think maintain a growth mindset. I have been fortunate enough and super grateful to have the job I have, and I think that it's taught me a lot. Like I've learned a ton about a whole bunch of things I've never thought I would ever learn about. And that's just working with really, smart people solving really challenging problems. And I think maintaining that growth mindset and just being willing to be humble about it. And like, I don't actually know what you guys are talking about. Can you help me understand this? You're going to learn it more quickly than you think. And so I think just getting that growth mindset and get it clicking and working for you, and chasing that is a really good principle to follow. So ultimately, the objective you want to be embedded with these teams versus kind of being a sort of outside arm's length advisor. The more you can embed with them in their process and their work, the more you're going to be a trustworthy part of the project.
Thanks, Evan. And I think diving a little bit deeper into one of these bullets around meeting developers where they are, I think a natural sort of follow up there would be like, well, like, where are they? Right? Like, what sort of tools, what sort of technologies, and what sort of, system owners, like, how do you actually like get answers to these questions?
Yeah. So I think number one is that get in early, right? So it kind of the principles feed off of one another, right? But I think like get in early to meet them where they are. One example of that is invest a lot in discovery. Discover as much as you can about these teams. It's hard to do because there's so many things putting downward pressure on you and your job on a day-to-day. I need to get this contract shipped out. I need to like have these 3 meetings. I need to do, this admin work for my team because, we're not a law firm and we're all managing our own calendars and our own PTO and whatever it is in-house. That's the reality. But you have to make time and space for this discovery effort. And what I mean by that is, identify the people in the feature group or product group that are in control, that are at the helm, that are at the wheel of what's being built, right? Like find out who those people are, take them to lunch, like have a virtual coffee with them, right? Talk to them, and just talk to them about what they do. Like, are they into board games? Do they collect, some interesting thing that they collect? Do they like hiking? Are they really into coffee? Do you have any common ground? I love Metallica. Is there anybody in this team that loves Metallica or other types of music, right? Like we could talk about that and relate as human beings. That's super duper important, because what it does is it'll help you establish that rapport that will then help you get to the next step, which is more like, well, who owns our build systems? Right. So I'm taking FOSSA as the example, right? If I want to implement FOSSA as a tool to help our teams manage open source compliance, like I have to know what it's going to plug into, right? Like what are the underlying systems that our software teams are using and orienting themselves around to actually build our stuff, right? What are those systems? Who are the system owners, right? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the sort of DRIs, the directly responsible individual, right? Find that information out. It might be in a wiki somewhere, but the better way to get it is to actually get it from someone, because you'll get a richer picture and you'll often get a narrative from them about sort of what the challenges are. And the more you kind of like develop that rapport, the better the information you will be that you wind up extracting from these folks. So ask them how they do their work, what tools they use, who's in charge of what piece, and then let them teach you, right? So these are great conversations to actually help you resolve things you don't understand. So if somebody says a word that you're like, oh, I don't actually know what that word means, which happens all the time when supporting engineers, like let them teach you in that moment. Like, hey, while we're having coffee, can you tell me more about X technology? Like, why is it so good? Why is it better than the old thing? That can really help you gain some insight. And then again, just establish yourself as someone who actually cares about the work they're doing, and you're not there to just tell them no. A personal example of this, when I implemented FOSSA the first time, I naively didn't really do a lot of this and didn't really understand that I would need buy-in from actually not just the engineering leadership, but I'd need from IT and another set of teams within IT and subgroups, because our build systems were super complicated. And the way that we sort of pulled all of the code base together, for lack of a better term, was kind of a mosaicked group of teams and systems. And so I needed FOSSA to look at the whole thing. And I needed a team within IT to actually administer FOSSA. And so it actually took me some fits and starts, because there were timelines that I didn't understand. There were people, there were resourcing, there were politics, there were all sorts of things I didn't really grasp. And here's me coming in and saying like, oh, I need open source compliance like at scale, because we're moving from waterfall to agile and doing a lot more distributed work in the engineering world. So like it's becoming harder and harder for me and my team to actually give you the compliance, sort of checkbox you need to be able to ship this thing. I thought that would be enough, and it wasn't, until I went around and kind of got everybody on board. And so doing that work, getting everybody on board, was really actually just building relationships, like I just said at the beginning of the slide. So I think for me, that was a huge learning. And it's something that I've taken to heart and try to do in my work pretty deliberately. Probably might feel extremely deliberate to some of the people on the other side sometimes, but I think it does help me feel a lot more confident in my ability to be part of their team and their workflows. So I think, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a very good segue, of course, into some of the, I think, specific environments that engineers are living in. And, I think regardless of profession, but certainly in the in-house legal world, whenever there are new tools and new things that that impact work, there's always a challenge in understanding them and understanding how key stakeholders interact with them. And I think this is certainly true in the engineering world, perhaps more so than most. And wondering, Evan, if you could just sort of talk through some of these new engineering preferred tools and kind of the important elements of them for in-house legal to grasp.
Yeah, I think this is not meant to be an exhaustive list at all, and it's really just meant to highlight a couple things. Number one is the ecosystem for engineers is wild. There's new tooling, new whiz-bang technology that people are bringing to bear on their projects daily, weekly. Some of it's proprietary and sold. Some of it's open sourced and accessible and sort of free to all. Check the license to make sure that you can actually use it. But it's a wild world out there, right? That your developers are working in, and so I think don't be intimidated by that. I think the key is again, be flexible, be willing to be uncomfortable, approach with a growth mindset, and don't be intimidated. So just to give you like a short list of some really core like backbone engineering platforms that people use are sort of the Atlassian suite. So I've got Jira and Confluence up there. I mean, a lot of development work occurs in that set of platforms and tools that's provided by Atlassian. So you're gonna likely work in and see information mapped and stored and housed in Confluence, sort of a wiki tool where engineers will oftentimes describe the project they're working on, keep running lists of notes of meetings that they've had, ways that they've tried to explore solving the problem. That can be a very rich place to go search. So if you're scratching your head, trying to figure out where to start on a project, if you have access to their Confluence, poke around on their wikis. You'll probably learn a whole bunch of information. Jira is another Atlassian project management tool that is kind of a way to shove tickets back and forth, frankly, among engineers. So you work on this aspect of the project, we'll track the work, we'll close out the ticket when it's done. That's kind of the basic, capability of Jira. And I think it's really important to know and understand how Jira works, because you may need to hover into that, sort of helicopter into that platform from time to time. If you're really sophisticated about it and want to go deep, I'd love to talk to anybody, who reaches out after the webinar. I have some experience actually building sort of like legal review workflows in Jira, so we could meet teams where they are and just be like part of their project workflow. FOSSA, for example, has a Jira integration. So if you are doing a license review on some open source project or code base, and your policy triggers a problem that FOSSA helps you understand, you can actually fire a ticket to the team that owns that part of the code base and kind of work with them directly in a tool that they understand to go solve that problem and clear out the problem. So that's Jira. Slack, I'm sure hopefully everybody has some experience with Slack. Love it, hate it. I think it's here to stay. But it's, communication platform heavily adopted by engineers. I would say there's lots of projects and things similar to Confluence. There's lots of really interesting use cases in Slack where I've seen teams really use it like a wiki and use it like a Confluence. So there's a huge sort of knowledge base that gets developed in Slack that you can go tap, and you'd be surprised what you find out there. GitHub is a source code repository and sort of developer toolkit system and service that it's pretty straightforward to kind of get oriented to GitHub. That there's a lot. They actually have published a lot of great information. So if you just go poke around on that website, and if you have any experience with open source at all, keep a stiff upper lip and understand GitHub. And then Kubernetes, I put this one on here because this is me trying to be vulnerable a little bit and tell you that, there's a story about to Kubernetes and the Googling being your best friend. The very first time I heard what Kubernetes is or was, it's an open source system for automating deployment and management of containerized applications. So it's an infrastructure, tool, basically, or development resource that backend engineers love. The very first time I heard it, I didn't have any clue what it was, and I was sitting in a meeting. This is back when we were all still in person. I was in a conference room, and I was like looking at my computer and trying to make sure that no one was seeing that I was Googling what the heck Kubernetes was. And at the time, I still didn't really understand it after reading the article, but I knew enough bits and pieces that, just in that Google session, I was able to kind of start asking some other questions. And by the end of the meeting, I think I had a pretty good grip on at least what it was conceptually. And so I think that's just a way to say, hey, even people, and at that point I had been supporting that engineering team for probably 2 years. So, even when you feel like you're an expert in learning, there's always something new. So don't be afraid to kind of, just go to Google and use it as a resource. It can be your best friend sometimes.
I think that's true almost regardless of profession. Always need to do some research. And so, as we now look toward the end of this webinar, I think we want to close with a look at two pretty specific engineering and legal collaboration kind of areas of collaboration, processes that involve collaboration, and how these have changed, and sort of what needs to happen from a legal perspective to respond. And the first is open source license compliance, which is obviously something near and dear to us at FOSSA, something you've discussed as well. But really, just the popularity of open source, how ubiquitous it is, coupled with these agile software development workflows, has changed. I know legal's role in this and sort of the process that needs to be in place to manage compliance on a continuous basis.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can't stress this enough. There's a couple of areas that can cause a lot of friction, and I actually approach this more from the like customer, especially in the B2B space where I operate in and my teams operate in. Customers will diligence your product, especially the enterprise customers, in ways that are extremely sophisticated and very intrusive, and with very high expectations. And so I actually approach both open source and like privacy from not so much a pure legal compliance lens, but more of a how am I going to package this information and get information about our compliance position, because hopefully we've done a relatively good job trying to keep up with what the law requires. How am I going to get that information and package it to my customer, so in their diligence process they don't decide not to buy my product because I can't tell them what open source is in it, for example? Or if you're a pure SaaS product, people luckily are asking less and less for your sort of bill of materials. I've seen that trend happen, but it doesn't mean they don't ask. And actually, it probably means you really need to be prepared, because when they do ask, it's going to be the deal that's going to make or break your quarter. And if you can't provide the list, that'll be a problem. So I think open source is an interesting use case to look at. That number is right. And it's kind of crazy, right? Like code-based modern applications, like no one's rebuilding the wheel on things like time calculaters. There's open source programs for that you can go download and install and leverage in your own build. So 90% of a code base for a modern application probably has some open source flavor to it. So that means that you're going to have a real crazy time trying to figure out what the license compliance regime is for any particular feature you're shipping or any particular product you're shipping, if you are doing it all manually and if you have to do it monthly. So I think, basically, I'm not sure how you could do it if your team is truly using a lot of open source, like most teams are, and is truly operating in an agile way. I'm not sure how you would do real open source compliance without some kind of tooling. There are a whole bunch of tools available. I like FOSSA because it's really built for lawyers and security and engineering teams. So it's taking into account all three personas. A lot of the other tools out there will be kind of looking at just one of the personas and then have these like sort of add-ons that are meant to address the needs of the other personas involved. But I think when you're evaluating a tool, so number one, I think you need a tool. I'm not sure how you would do it manually otherwise. If you have budget for it, great, go out and get one, stat. And when you're exploring the tools, look for the use cases and how they're aimed and targeted at the different personas on your team. Do they have policy templates that are pre-built that you can pick off the rack, so you're not sort of like making up your own policies from scratch? And then do they integrate with your build systems? So going back to the discussion earlier about just knowing how your teams work and what they're using and what their platforms are, can that tool you're looking for to help make your life better, does it integrate with what you actually use? Resolve that question, and run it to the ground, because that'll be really important. You don't want it to be shelfware later. And then does it support like a sort of a continuous compliance? Like how well does it do with the kind of daily, monthly, weekly scanning cadence and review cadence that you'll probably want to be on if your team's moving in an agile way? So those are sort of recommendations I'd have there.
Great. And this last slide in our presentation probably could be a webinar in and of itself. But to the extent it's possible to sort of give some high level points, some highlights, wondering if you could speak, Evan, to some of what you found particularly important in being able to manage due diligence and potentially due diligence on very tight timelines in this modern world of engineering.
Yeah, I think that in my role right now is running a legal team and kind of building out our legal program and function at a rapidly growing company. This is definitely on my mind because the fundraising environments are there and the windows are there, and they with markets being sort of what they are in the macro world. You have to be ready for these windows, right? And part of that means you need to be able to withstand a diligence effort in a really tight timeline. And I think that could go for even a more mature company that's being acquired by another acquisitive business. You need to be ready whether for that exit and that event, and that's a duty you really owe to your shareholders and to yourself, as just part somebody focused on doing the legal work that helps the company retain its shareholder value, right? So FOSSA can help, or a tool like FOSSA could help, and automating really any of your compliance tasks to the extent you can and you have budget for it. Try to make those investments because they will pay off when that next fundraising or exit sort of event occurs for your business. And it's harder to sort of plan those events these days is what I'm getting at. So I think that, an example for us, we're in the process of, doing our next stage of implementation at FOSSA at Abnormal. We're still pretty sort of relatively immature business, and we're being forced to mature rapidly because of our growth. And so that means that we have to sort of take on these projects like installing a tool like FOSSA, for example. I put the tool in place, and then we entered a fundraising round, and I was really happy that my CISO and I did it. It wasn't really by design, actually, but that was the that wound up being extremely helpful because we were able to, even though we hadn't had it fully rolled out and fully baked and tuned and optimized and everything, it was a way that we could pull very quickly a bill of materials that the other side in the diligence that the investment counsel were looking for, and we were able to actually stick to our timeline because we had some automation in place. And so that's just another example of sort of being diligence ready. So I would say, think even beyond a tool like FOSSA. Think about sort of like how you keep a data room on demand, and where that data room might live, and how it's being updated, and to the extent it can be updated in an automated way. So your CLM, if you have one, might be important in that kind of in that exercise and that design, for example. Try to think about that, because I do think that's going to be one of the bigger challenges that legal teams or groups within legal functions are going to face, is executives saying, hey, we need to do this thing to preserve or optimize value, and I need this information from you about our aspects of our compliance. And it's going to be a tighter timeline, and it's going to be not one that you control for the next foreseeable future, given the macro environment we're working in. So I think staying diligence ready through process and tooling is going to be really important.
Well, that wraps up the meat of our presentation. Thank you, Evan, so much for those insights, that overview, and some of the strategies you covered. At this point, please do feel free to submit questions. We have a few minutes to take them. I think one actually that I have that I was thinking of is when we talk about getting to know colleagues in engineering departments and other sort of key stakeholders. You recommended taking them out for a coffee or for a lunch. In addition to that, though, there are, I think, a lot of both like async and on the books type meetings and opportunities for connection that exist. Engineering often has, I know, like daily stand-ups. They are heavy on Slack. How do you? What have you found from your experience? Tends to be the most effective way to sort of integrate into almost like the engineering communication world.
Yeah, that's a really it's challenging, and I think it's going to depend on it's challenging but doable, and I think it's going to depend on your engineering team's specific you know engine, like how, again, like how are they organizing their work, right? Some teams may use these platforms and have these stand-ups and be a big fan of writing everything down in a Confluence wiki, and if it's not there, it's not the truth. Right? Other teams might be working in a very different way. And so I think, just again, it's like understanding the structure of the team, understanding what their responsibilities are, understanding what tools they use, and to your point, don't overlook in that exploration like the communication tools they're using, right? And meeting them in the space where they're at is really important. So two things I've done with different teams, right? I had a team that I supported working on a feature set that was pretty sort of cabined. The team was kind of together and siloed in some way, and they had their own way of working, and they did virtually everything in Jira. It's like they wouldn't communicate if it wasn't in a Jira ticket. And so I was like, you're not receptive to my emails. You don't want to meet in person. You don't even use Slack. And like, if it's not in Jira, it doesn't exist, right? So I had to basically, that's what precipitated my like need to basically figure out a way to build a legal review cadence and kind of workflow and process within Jira to support that team, because there was no other way they were engaging. Once I was there, it was just another gate for them to clear in Jira. And they were actually great, right? And we got into a great rhythm working that way. The other approach I've taken, and I've done this at Abnormal as well, is just like I create a Slack channel. We use Slack, so and engineers have adopted that heavily at Abnormal. And we have a an Ask a Product Lawyer Slack. That's the name of the channel. People can reach out and have a question, and we pin posts there and things that are useful resources for people to go back and use. We'll try not to do a lot of like actual legal advising there, but it's a lot of traffic copying and directing communications to the right place, or kind of one-off questions to answers, or and answers to questions where like the answer or advice you're giving actually isn't that like sensitive. But we can be the judge of that, for the formality that needs to happen, but at least we're giving them an informal space for them to reach out where they feel comfortable and it feels like their turf. And that's a cool thing, I think, for them. So
Yeah. Next question. How do you work with your dev teams regarding management of third-party attribution reports and notices?
yeah, I actually, so this is like the next phase of FOSSA implementation for us at Abnormal. There are ways to do this. I've done it manually in the past, and that's literally through a spreadsheet, like a Google. The way that I've set it up manually is kind of a two-pronged approach, where you have an engineer has access to your policy. It's it's very stoplight, like green, yellow, red. Like, don't use these 5 license types. Use these if you need if you need to use something in this yellow category, like come talk to us. And then you have like a submission. It's like a Google form where they say, I want to use this open source component, and you can pre-clear it there and then track it in the back end of a spreadsheet. And then hopefully that stuff will show up on your manual reports and pulls. And then it's just a manual exercise of like going through each one and making sure that the attribution is there and the notices are there. And that's brutal, like absolutely brutal to do. FOSSA and other tools that are out there do have ways to automate this and ways to actually help make sure that you're only looking at sort of stuff that's not been previously approved. So when the idea is you build a baseline of kind of like, these are the notices, these are the attributions that will actually feed a report that FOSSA can generate for you, and you can publish, as a PDF. You can host it in HTML. There's different ways you can do that publication. So basically, I would say some of the tools, this is what the power of some of these tools that are available now is they've taken work that's super duper manual and made it sort of much more manageable and even automated purely in some senses. I've had much more positive experience when you're just focused on like getting 5 attributions right because FOSSA doesn't recognize them, or there's no attribution available for FOSSA to understand or locate. And so then you're looking at a much smaller subset of information. And so I think that can actually solve a lot of the problem right there, is if you're focusing your efforts and their efforts, their meaning the engineers, on a smaller subset of issues, because you've got an automated tool in place that's actually taking care of it, for lack of a better term. But it does take some time when you install a tool. It does take some time to go through manually and build the baseline out. So I don't know if that helps with the question, but hopefully.
Next question. Yep. Next question. When you are a software factory that sells developments for its clients, it's common that clients require intellectual property rights transfer, which is restricted when the development is based on open source software. Can you give advice to handle that client's expectations?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think like I'm not sure the actual like legal setup or implications, and I obviously can't provide the legal advice to you directly on that, but I can say that handling the client's expectations around it, in my view, like transparency is always the best route. And so come up with a talk track and some artifacts around how you develop, what components you use, why you use them, why it's advantageous to use them, etc. And that can help with just setting the client's expectations up front. Like, I'm going to use open source in this project. Here's why, and here's why you shouldn't be worried. So develop a point of view, document it, and then package that information so that that client can, in their diligence of you and your service and what you're going to provide, can really understand the kind of like what, why of what you're doing. I think that can go a really long way. And then just in terms of like making sure you're covered on your side, I think having a really strong policy around what your team and developers are going to be able to use, that's okay, right? Because there are certain open source licenses and components you could use and basically include in a commercial output that you would then sell and transfer from an IP perspective as maybe works made for hire to that client of yours. There are licenses that would permit that. There's licenses that wouldn't, right? And so I think that having a real good handle on like what licenses you're comfortable with your development teams using, and so that's kind of like a policy, program that you can implement, and then having some way to check their code. So again, it's sort of like either a script that you're going to run manually to understand what the bill of materials is they're actually delivering to your client, and having some kind of review before it gets to the client is really important, if that's a concern of yours. But having some sort of automated way to do that with like a tool like a FOSSA could be really powerful as well, just to make sure you're managing your risk.
Great. Well, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you again, Evan, so much for being here and for this presentation. Great stuff. Really insightful on really what is a changing landscape, I think, for all of us who work in and around the software world. So can't thank you enough for taking the time to be here. And of course, thank you also to everyone for taking time out of your days to attend this webinar. I really hope you found it useful and took away some interesting guidance. So as I mentioned at the top, we will be following up with a link to the on-demand recording into the slide deck, where you will find contact information for Evan. I know he mentioned a few specific areas that he was more than happy to talk through with folks individually. So please feel free, of course, to reach out to him. Similarly, if you have any questions about what we do at FOSSA, how we can support your organization's license compliance program, you can just reply to one of those emails as well. So with that, we will close today's webinar. Thanks so much again, everyone, for being here. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, everybody.